The year was 1898. More than 3 decades had passed since the end of the American Civil War, yet its scars were still etched into the very fabric of the nation. The country had changed. Railroads now connected distant cities, factories belched smoke into the sky, and electric streetlights illuminated the avenues of New York and Chicago. The world was moving forward, but for the men who had fought in the bloodiest conflict in American history, time had not been so kind. For the veterans, the war never truly ended. They carried its weight in their body slims, lost to cannon fire, lungs scarred by disease from the filthy encampments. But even more so, they carried it in their minds. The ghosts of fallen comrades lingered in their memories, their final cries still echoing in the dark hours of the night. Many had returned home to find a country that no longer understood them. Some became farmers, some found work in factories, others drifted through towns and cities, forgotten by the nation they had fought to preserve. But now, for perhaps the last time, they were coming together once more. This year, Washington, D.C. would host a grand reunion final march of the veterans. From every corner of the country, from northern industrial towns to southern plantations, old soldiers were making their way to the capital. For many, this would be the last time they would stand beside those who had once fought alongside them. A man haunted by the past. Among them was Major James Harrison, once a young and fearless cavalry officer in the Union Army. Now he was old, his back hunched, a wooden cane replacing the saber he had once wielded. He had come from Tennessee, where he had tried to start a new life after the war, but no matter how far he traveled, he could never escape the guilt. He had been only 25 years old when he led his cavalry unit into battle at Chancellorsville. In the chaos of the fight, his eyes had locked onto a Confederate soldier, a young man with fiery red hair, barely more than a boy. Their gazes met for just a second, and even then, James knew. The boy was too young to die. But James had already pulled the trigger. Now, as he walked among the veterans, past waving flags and cheering crowds, he could feel something was wrong. It was as if he was not alone. He turned his head slightly, expecting to see an old friend beside him, but instead, he saw something impossible. A young man with red hair. His uniform was tattered, his expression blank, his chest still marked by the bullet wound James had given him over 30 years ago. James felt his heart seize. The crowd around him blurred. The sound of marching feet grew distant. The young soldier was still there, watching him. Then, without warning, the world shifted. A step back in time. James blinked, and suddenly, he was no longer in Washington. He was back on the battlefield. The thunder of cannons shook the ground. The acrid scent of gunpowder filled the air, and the cries of wounded men echoed through the trees. His uniform was no longer worn, and faded was young again, his saber gleaming in the morning sun. But something was wrong. He was not reliving the past. He was watching it. Just a few feet away, he saw himself his younger self riding through the smoke, raising his revolver. Across the field, he saw the red-haired boy again, standing there, frozen, unarmed. James tried to shout, to stop himself, but his younger self could not hear him. The revolver fired. The boy collapsed. And then, silence. James found himself back in the present. The streets of Washington reappeared around him. The flags were still waving, the crowd still cheering, but something inside him had changed. The ghost was gone. James felt tears well up in his eyes. He pulled off his hat, lowered himself to his knees, and whispered a quiet prayer. 3 days later, they found him in his hotel room, his old war medal clutched in his hands. A smile was on his lips, as if, at last, he had found peace. The Forgotten Warriors. James Harrison's story was not unique. He was just one of thousands of veterans who had lived with the burden of war for decades. Some had nightmares of battles they wished they could forget. Others had lost everything: their homes, their families, their purpose. The final march in Washington was not just a celebration, it was a farewell. Time running out for the men who had once fought at Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh. By the early 1900s, their numbers had dwindled. The country moved on, building a new future, leaving the past behind. The veterans faded away, their voices lost in history. But their faces remain, captured in old photographs, their eyes staring back at us through time. And if you look closely enough, you can still hear them. Every photograph is a story. Every stare is a memory. And every soldier, no matter how long ago they marched, still waits to be remembered.